when you look at the risk of gambling addiction, it overlaps heavily with young, male, stress, those sort of things amongst service members, right? There's always been this higher risk. And what we came up with was that there really needs to be more research into this space. The federal government doesn't currently do any research into gambling addiction in general, but not in the military.
Sports leagues, schools, gambling operators, and others are at-risk groups for experiencing gambling harm. Epic Global Solutions partners with these groups to help reduce gambling harm. Epic's staff harness personal experience of gambling harm, along with expertise to help navigate the impacts of gambling safely and sustainably, enhancing your organization's reputation and strengthening your performance. If you're an organization looking to better understand gambling and gambling harm, tap into the global leader in gambling harm reduction. Learn more at epicglobalsolutions.com. This is the Fall In Podcast. My name's Dave. I'm a veteran of the United States Army and gratefully in recovery for a gambling addiction since January 2020. A little bit of background before I introduce our guest. The National Council on Problem Gambling was started back in 1972 with a mission and vision to improve health and wellness by reducing the personal, social, and economic costs of problem gambling. So the idea is for NCPG, or the National Council on Problem Gambling, to be the national voice for the reduction of gambling harm in our country. I want to introduce to you the Director of Government Relations and League Partnerships for the National Council on Problem Gambling, and his name's Cole Wogoman. Hi, Cole. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate this opportunity.
No, it's an honor and a pleasure. I've been waiting for this for some time to have you on here. So I'm really glad you said yes. Let's start with this. Tell me a little bit about you. Tell me about your background, where you come from, what brought you to NCPG, and then talk about your current position because it's an interesting title, Director of Government Relations and League Partnerships. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, my name's Cole Wogoman. I'm the Director of Government Relations and League Partnerships, as you said, at the National Council on Problem Gambling. So a little bit about myself. I am a lawyer technically by training. I am barred attorney. I went to law school, and right after that, I started working at a law firm. You know, they call it big law out here on the East Coast. I didn't really enjoy the work. I didn't feel like I was making a difference in the world. And it was a lot of hours and kind of boring at times. I always liked politics, and I thought I'd end up wanting to get involved in that. And so I got a job. I was trying to get a job to work on the Hill, so work in Congress, because I do live in Washington, D.C., and that's where I was practicing law. And while I was applying, somebody got my resume who is a city council member. That is like the legislative branch of Washington, D.C., the city council. And Washington, D.C. is really interesting because it's kind of a county and a city and a state all in one. And they said, hey, would you be interested in working at the local level instead of the federal level? And I said, sure. So I worked for her for 3 years. And the reason this ties in is one of the issues we worked on was the legalization of sports betting, because this was after PASPA was overturned. So in 2018, DC was one of the first jurisdictions to look at legalizing sports betting. And I was her lead staffer on that. And what really struck me was that there was no one talking about gambling addiction. It was just politicians and lobbyists worried about wanting to bring in as much money to the government as they could. How do we make money so that we have more money to spend? Which I totally understand, and there's a time and place for that. However, there's also has to be the view of, well, what about the harms that could come from a new form of gambling?
Yeah.
And so the only people who came to testify was NCPG, and they came once. And the reason they only came once is because there were so many states trying to legalize at once. They were flying across the country. They didn't have the bandwidth to have in-depth conversations. And so the way the bill ended up at the time, it's since been amended a few times, is I think it was $200,000 a year to problem gambling, and that was it. That's barely one person's salary and benefits, let alone the materials and the ad campaigns that you'd want to see. That really struck me, and that's something I cared about. I don't have a personal experience with gambling addiction, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that if you're bringing about new forms of an addictive activity, problems are going to increase, and you got to mitigate those harms. And so I do care about it. I'm very passionate about it, and now I've learned a lot about it since then. So to wrap up this story, Dave, sorry, I'm going on and on. A short while after that, maybe a year or two after that, I saw a job posting at NCPG for a government relations manager. And so I applied for it and got it right because I was very passionate about it, and I knew a lot about the legalization of sports betting and what jurisdictions think about, and the things they take into account and the things they don't, but they should take into account. So that was in 2021. I've been here ever since. Gotten promoted a few times, and now have bigger responsibility. So I oversee, as director of government relations, our state government relations and our federal government relations. And then as with league partnerships, which is also in my title, since 2018, our relationship with sports leagues has really grown because sports leagues are now promoting sports betting. They want to try to mitigate harms that could occur. And so we work with almost every major sports league. It became clear that we needed a staffer who was kind of their direct go to. And then I can direct them within the organization for whatever they
Right.
need. So sometimes we advise them on their PSA campaigns. Sometimes we advise them on how to get help for a player who may have a problem, that sort of thing. And it's easier for them to come to me, and then I can say, oh, you actually want to go talk to this person in our office, or let me get you someone who's an expert in this. I can get you on the phone with them, that sort of thing.
Okay, so you've got a lot of background, and we're drawn to this basically because you saw the need for the reduction of harm, and that's I think that's a great reason to move into a job like this. As somebody who's in recovery for this addiction, I appreciate the fact that you saw the need and you jumped into it. You jumped into that need, and I see it every time I talk to you, Cole. I see your passion
Huh.
for what you do, so, and personally, I appreciate it.
No, that means a lot to me, and I obviously appreciate. We can talk more about it as we talk, but the work you've done for us, which is telling your story. Also, now with sports betting,
Mhm.
my generation, so kind of I'm starting to age out of the younger one, but the young 30s male, the gambling has really taken off, and I know
Yeah.
you know this. So like used to be that maybe my friends would go to a casino once every 6 months. But now it's on your phone, and so my generation is gambling a lot more than they used to.
Yeah, it's significantly more, and the average age of the person who's struggling with gambling has gone way down. It really has. It used to be, an older generation going to a casino, and that's where a lot of the problems were. And now more and more and more, you're seeing sports betting and online casino is where the problems are coming in. So let me ask you this: as somebody who's on the Hill and you're working the Hill all the time, can you give me, before we get into kind of the big issue that we want to talk about,
Mhm.
today? Can you give me a little bit of the history of advocacy as it relates to military service members, veterans, and gambling on the Hill? What have
Sure.
we pushed for? What have we been able to accomplish? What have we not accomplished? That sort of thing.
Well, that list is long, so I'll give you some highlights. But
Okay, that sounds good.
NCPG has long said that veterans and service members are vulnerable populations when it comes to gambling. And we know that for many reasons you can explain better than me through your story and through your expertise now. When you look at the risk of gambling addiction, it overlaps heavily with young male. PTSD can play a role, stress, those sort of things that we're seeing amongst service members, right? There's always been this higher risk. So NCPG for a long time has prioritized that. And back in 2017. Don't quote me on the exact year. We pushed hard to get a provision. This is before I worked here, obviously, my predecessors, but to get a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act committee report that would require service branches to start screening for gambling addiction. And they have started doing that. I think that there might be questions about how they're doing it and whether they're doing it the right way, and whether when you ask someone if they gamble, they might say no, and then you ask if they play the lottery, they say yes. It's like sometimes there's a disconnect of what is gambling. And I
Mhm.
think there might be thoughts that some service members are just checking off no so they don't have to answer more questions. All those sort of things are still present, but they at least are asking about it now, which they
Yeah.
never did before. And so building off that, we did have a piece of legislation where we looked to do a few different things, but one of the big things was the slot machines on overseas military bases right now. They exist. Way more about them than I do from your personal story. As NCPG, we should have led with this at the top, but we're neutral on legalized gambling. We don't take a position
Mhm.
for or against it. We're here to mitigate harm as much as we can, and we'll work with people on all sides of the gambling spectrum. So we're not looking to get those slot machines removed necessarily, but we are saying where are the protections in place? Where is there someone on base who is trained to spot a gambling addiction, who's trained to intervene, trained to counsel in that? And that's essentially non-existent. And so when you look at these overseas military bases, and so we had some language in a bill. It's called the GAP Act, the Gambling Addiction Prevention Act. It was a military focused to try to put those slot machines on military bases on par with what you'd see in the United States in casinos, which have regulations and staff trained to spot things, that sort of thing. So that those are some of our previous efforts. One was a success, right? And then the bill was never ended up making itself into law. So that one still has some work to do.
Are you feeling like nobody understands what you're dealing with? If you're struggling with a gambling addiction or feel like you might be, this app could change everything. eVive is an app that meets you where you're at in your gambling journey. Whether you're just starting with gambling, you're feeling like it's becoming a problem, or you're ready to leave it behind. This app provides insights and resources for every step in the journey to help you define and understand your gambling habits. There's help and hope available, and eVive is a great place to start the journey. Check them out today and redefine your relationship with gambling. Only available in certain locations. So a lot of effort gone forth. And here's the thing. You hear some talk, or you'll see on social media sometimes, that talk about the initiatives that NCPG or any organization really is doing to try to forward legislation. And I'm going to stick to the military because that's where we are
Mhm.
right now, for legislation to mitigate gambling harm among the military. So you might hear a blurb on Instagram or on LinkedIn or somewhere like that. What people don't see is the volumes and volumes of work that go behind trying to get that legislation put
Right.
forward. Can you just talk about, and you don't have to go into too much detail, can you just kind of brush over an overview of the kind of work it takes to get somebody's attention on an issue like this?
Takes a lot of legwork. You spend a lot of time meeting with congressmen, staffers. That's where you really start, and explaining to them why something's an issue. And you want to have as much research on you as you can to explain it. That's the easy part, right? The harder part is bringing it home, so to speak, showing the member and their staff how this affects their constituents. You live in Pennsylvania, so we'd want to make sure your Congress member realizes that she has constituents in her district that suffer from gambling addiction. She might
Right.
not even realize that, especially with the military focus. And then there's also they do a calculus. All members do this, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, whatever. Of like, is this good for me politically? Like, should I be spending time and resources doing this? You could put that another way to say, is this actually helping my constituents, or is this focused on something else? You kind of go through that sort of dance, and what you really need is a member who can kind of have all those categories overlap and say, this is something I care about. This is something my constituents care about. This is something I acknowledge needs federal intervention in one way or another. And so that all that, can sound easy, but it's not easy. And so it's a lot of legwork, it's a lot of meetings, a lot of phone calls, and a lot of having constituents like yourself when we talk to someone from Pennsylvania who can come in and explain what they're seeing on the ground. So we've had meetings with members from Pennsylvania where we've had you, and we've also had the head of our Pennsylvania affiliate, come in and talk about the work he does and his team does in the state. When it comes to military stuff, it kind of transcends partisanship. There's not many issues left that do that. In my experience, both Republicans and Democrats want the best for our service members. It's not that we get a lot of folks on the Hill saying they don't care about this. It's
Mhm.
more they don't even realize it's a problem, right? Like it
Right.
takes a lot of education to get them up to speed about gambling addiction in the military or whatever vulnerable population we're advocating for at the time.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that, I think, because, there are people who, you see, and I've been to DC on like advocacy days and that sort of thing, and you go around all these different places and talk to all these different people without realizing that the next day another group with another cause is going to be doing the same
Absolutely.
thing, and the next day another group with another cause is going to be doing the same thing, and these guys have to take all this information in, decide where the important issues are and what they're going to move forward with. I mean, I can't imagine how many issues these guys get bombarded with. So when we go in there and we speak, we have to have impact so that that
Mhm.
issue moves to the top of the ladder. So I appreciate you kind of describing that. That was a great
Yeah,
overview, if you will.
yeah, it's showing the member why it matters back home, right? Why in their
Yeah.
district this matters, and that's always a key that people leave out. And advocacy days are great. We do that every year at NCPG. You don't have to be a member to participate. If anybody wants to participate, that's really just the first step. So an advocacy day oftentimes will have someone from Pennsylvania. I'm just using you as an example, but it could be anybody come in and do a meeting, and that gets us our foot in the door, and we show the member that we have boots on the ground, so to speak, in their state who care about this issue. But then there's follow up involved that I'm doing, calls, making sure that they have all the materials they need, making sure they don't let it slip off their radar, because that happens a lot. They'll say they're interested in a topic, and then if you don't stay on them, they have, like you said, somebody comes in the next day with a new issue and they're distracted and they've moved on. So there's a
Right.
lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, even after an advocacy day.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay, so given all that background, now that we've kind of set it up and everything, let's move all that into current efforts and efforts that have been going on for some time now. Talk a little bit about the current initiative, or as I like to call it, the acronym palindrome.
We put our heads together at NCPG this year, at the beginning of the year, and said, you know, what's a good first step in the, because we had kind of we've been kind of doing a piecemeal approach when it comes to militaries and veterans, and it was time to kind of regroup and say, okay, progress. We need to start making. We want to make more progress. Let's look at what is step one of a multi-step, successful
Mhm.
effort. And what we came up with was that there really needs to be more research into this space. The federal government doesn't currently do any research into gambling addiction in general, but not in the military. They do just they've at times done very little bits with the survey data they have, but it's minimal at best. No one's really put resources into it, and so we kind of said, okay, if we can get the research, then the next step will come easier, right? Which is we can try to use that research to get policy changed. And so we identified there's a fund in the defense appropriations bill that passes every year that the Senate works on. It's called the Peer Reviewed Medical Research Program. And what that is the Senate sets aside this fund of money, and then they list health issues that they believe are impacting military service members. And it kind of it ranges from the things you'd think of right away, like PTSD,
Mhm.
but it also has things like eating disorders, so things that maybe you wouldn't think of right away but do affect service members. And then what happens is once the Department of Defense gets that funding, they take a portion of this big chunk of money and put it towards all these causes to start researching. So we identified this fund and said this is really a prime opportunity to have gambling addiction added as an eligible research topic into the peer-reviewed medical research program, like you said, also known as the PRMRP. So that was what we started out with in January. And I could talk about the steps if you want, or we can go whichever direction you want. But it's the work that went into how we got where we are now.
Yeah, if you could take us through some of the highlighted steps, like, the speaking at the Hill and then some of the individual conversations. And I think it's going to be, I think it'll serve us to hear some of the work that really went in to try to make this thing happen.
Sure. So we started mapping out which senators we thought would have interest in this. So basically, the way it works, the committee of jurisdiction, the Senate Defense Appropriations Committee, is the one who has to write this into the bill, into the committee report, which gets attached to a bill. There has to be other senators telling them that they support this and they want this. So we identified some senators who we wanted to ask to help make this request, and then we started the meetings on the Hill, and that started more with me and some of our advocacy professionals, our consultants who help us, going on the Hill and starting those meetings. But then it kind of builds into, you start to get members who might be interested, and like I said earlier, you want to tie it back home. So that's where people like you really came in and helped. We had you on the Hill in March, telling your story to service members, to senators. Some of them were your senators, but some of them weren't as well. Just explaining what does the gambling addiction look like on the ground or in real life? I guess a better way to
Yeah.
describe it. I can give them stats and stats and stats, but if they don't hear a story like yours, it doesn't really quite put a face on it. If that makes sense. And so you were there. That was helpful, and you also did a bunch of virtual meetings with us afterwards, which was helpful. So then we had senators who were who had some of the stats, and they understood what it looked like in person to have a gambling addiction. You explained that very well, and then it kind of became the okay, how do we tie this in back home even better? So we had our state chapters sign a letter and also send notes to their senators who we were talking to. We had some of our staffers at NCPG because we are remote, so we're across the country, so we all have different senators. And then we actually went a step farther, which is not something NCPG has really done before, where we said, okay, we think this is a nonpartisan, non-controversial issue. Can we get some of our industry partners to sign on to this and say
Right.
this is an important thing? Which really, if you're a member of Congress and you have a gambling company and NCPG come to you and say something's important, like you're gonna listen and say, wait a second, we've got both sides of this issue here, bringing this up. So after some discussions and education, we had FanDuel, BetMGM, and MGM Resorts sign on in support of this work and publicly. And so, BetMGM is their head of responsible gambling. He's Rich Taylor. He's a Marine. You're not supposed to say former Marine, right? You're once a Marine, you're always a Marine. So,
Amen.
uh, yeah,
That's my understanding.
he's a Marine. And totally understands this issue better than a lot of people. So that was great. We had to have his partnership, and so we had just to tie this up, Dave. We had me doing work on the Hill. We had you telling a story that they needed to hear. We had state chapters and other folks in their states sending them emails, and we had the industry saying, this was important. And then we also had some of our board members, which you also are one, but uh, many others sending letters as well. So it was kind of an attack on all fronts to get their attention and explain why this needed to be in the PRMRP.
So all these efforts are taking place and building up ever since back in January, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, who starts listening? Who starts listening? Who jumps in? Who initiates this from on the hillside? In terms of can you talk about what senator or senators stepped into it and said this is important and we'll support it?
Sure. So senators played some different roles. Some were more on the silent front. So they would, there were a couple of senators who said, I'm not going to make a big hubbub about this. I'm not going to sign something publicly, but I will send a note to the committee and say I do support this work.
Okay.
And that was fine, right? But then we also had some senators who said, no, this is an important enough issue that I want, in Hill jargon, we'd say own it, own the issue, just like kind of make it part of what they're fighting for. And so the big one for us was Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico.
Mhm.
He is the one who basically led an off committee letter, which means a letter of senators who are not on the committee of jurisdiction that they then send to the Senate Defense Subcommittee and say, can you add this to the PRMRP? So the two
Okay.
senators who are on the two head senators, the ranking member and the chairman of the Defense Subcommittee, are Mitch McConnell of Kentucky and Chris Coons of Delaware. So those
Mhm.
were the two who were kind of getting the letters and making the final decision, them and their staff. So Ben Ray Lujan kind of led that letter, which was really huge for us. We needed somebody to step up and do
Sure.
it publicly, and he did. And then three senators signed on publicly to support his work. So that was Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, who we've worked with quite a bit, Angela Also Brooks from Maryland, and then Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, who we've also worked with in the past. So
Right.
four senators is a strong showing. And then, like I said, there were some other senators who didn't want to sign on, but did send kind of notes, to their colleagues saying this is important and we do support the work.
So it got some support. So after all this work, we've talked about it, you've presented, you've talked to many different staffers and then actual senators, and now it all comes together and now you've got senators saying, we hear it, it's important,
Mhm.
let's move it forward. Okay. So now it's moved forward. Now it's in committee. It's in discussion. What happens?
Well, I'm happy to announce, Dave, that yesterday the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, released their report, and gambling addiction was added to the PRMRP. So
Wow.
That's a big deal. The amount of funding for all the health issues they listed is $370 million. For gambling addiction, it depends on how things break down, but we estimate it'll be around $5 to $7 million in research for gambling addiction. Now, some of your listeners might be saying, well, isn't that kind of a rounding error for the federal government? It's like, yes, that is 100% true. But I would urge them to focus less on the amount and focus more on the precedent that we've set here. We've set a precedent here now where the Senate is telling the Department of Defense, you need to study gambling addiction amongst your ranks because we believe it is affecting the health and wellness of service members. That's a big step. It's not something Congress has ever done before. And it kind of, like I said at the beginning, is a step one because we will be able to take step two and step three and step four down the road. But we need to have something that is showing that Congress cares about this and is getting research started. The next steps of this are that it will need to pass the full Senate and it will need to pass the House. But historically, if it's in the committee report, it's very, very likely to end up passing those two
Okay.
chambers. So the
Okay.
hardest part was really getting it in the committee report, and we've accomplished that. And so once this hopefully passes before the end of the year, sometime in the next few months, they'll be able to open up the funding and the research will then get started. Whatever that brings us, we can also build off of. So it might be best practices of treatment. It might be more showing the statistics of, when does a soldier develop a problem? Is it
Right.
related to the slot machines? There's a whole, it could go a whole bunch of different directions.
Yeah, but the important part of it is it's started. The
Mhm.
initial nod of the heads are, yes, this is important and we want to move forward with it. I don't know if you know this or not, but now that once this gets like fully approved and it's signed off over the next couple of months or whatever happens, right? Do you know who I know it's peer review, but do you know who does the work?
It's a great question. So my understanding is that it's kind of opened up for bid. So different universities can bid on it. I know UNLV has a center that studies. They have some research who studies service members addiction.
Mhm.
I know Yale does. There's a few others, but my understanding is they'll basically put out a request for research based on their some criteria, and then you'll see researchers bid on it, and then whichever studies get selected will go forward.
Right. Yeah. I was just curious because with if you're adding gambling into a program like this, do you want research organizations that have a background in researching specifically gambling? And it's probably questions that we're not going to be able to answer or have the answers
Right.
for right now, but I was just curious. It's just something that came up for me.
My guess would be it's more of the first one. They're going to want people to bid on this who to put in proposals, I should say, who are experienced with this and can kind
Mhm.
of get started at a faster pace. But I'm not an expert in how that goes. So, like you said, maybe they'll select someone who has a lot of experience in a different kind of addiction, and the work
Okay.
can translate over.
Like you said, and I guess expand on this just a tiny bit if you can. Once we've gotten our foot in here, once this has begun to move forward, and now a year, 2 years down the road, we're starting to get some results back from this, maybe even 3 years. I don't know, whatever it takes, because I know research doesn't happen overnight. What do we do with that? What are next steps? Even we don't even necessarily need the results of the research, do we? Or is it just that
No,
now at least we've opened up the conversation, we can begin to move forward with more requests?
exactly. We've opened up the conversations. Don't get me wrong, the results of the research will be very important and they'll be
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
helpful, and that's the purpose. But when we go back, we can say the Senate has already acknowledged that this is a problem, right? They are saying it needs to be studied, and so here's where we can do more. And what that looks like will depend on a lot of different factors. What's the
Hmm.
political environment? What's the timeline on the research? A lot of questions that I don't have the exact answer to yet. However, there's many different routes we could go. Currently, the VA has, I believe, two inpatient treatment centers for gambling addiction. One is in Las Vegas, one is in Cleveland, and there's a lot of work that could be done expanding those, increasing their resources to be able to assist more service members. And you might be one of the ones who told me this. I can't remember. Even though the VA has those treatment centers, a lot of people don't even know about them.
Yeah.
So if you develop a problem on an overseas base, no one's going to think to send you to one of these things to get help. It's just not
Right.
even doesn't even come to mind. So there's a whole bunch of opportunity there to try to help the left hand talk to the right hand. Those are the sort of things. So I'm not ready to commit to what the next step will be, but this will help us whenever we decide what that is. This will help us quite a bit.
And I guess that was good. That was the other part of my question. You kind of answered it already, is as those questions or as those directions start to reveal themselves, does NCPG step in and help to facilitate that with the knowledge base that we carry and the different people that we're connected to? Do we leave them to our own devices, or do we say, okay, we're here for you. Let's now connect you with resources to be able to move forward with this?
Oh, I certainly hope we play a role. We have either expertise through our 50 some years of working on these issues, but including board members like yourself who have lived experience. But we also just know folks in the field. NCPG, because we are neutral on legalized gambling, I oftentimes think of us as the hub of the wheel. We
Mhm.
bring together people with all different positions and stances on gambling. And so we know people from who are experts in all different areas and topics, and we could certainly help guide that if that's what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's the important part is that the important part is we've got the conversation started, right? We've got, the Senate to say this is important, we need to move it forward. Now that I think the next important part of the conversation is to say, okay, now we're starting to gather some information. Now let's create some direction of where to go with this information,
Absolutely.
And what's the next question we ask now that we're beginning to answer this one? And it sounds like you're that's exactly what you were describing. And knowing all of these different areas and factions from, people within the industry to people within the research field to people within the treatment community, what a great tool to be able to reach out and say, well, this organization does this, or these people do that, or this person does this, and here's a great resource for you. So it's just good to know that there is somebody right there, in DC who they can go to and say, "Hey, Cole, what do we do with this?"
Yeah,
And even if you don't have the answer, you probably know who to go to get the answer for it.
exactly. I think that's a big benefit NCPG brings is we are able to point you in the right direction if we don't have the answer. But I would add to your point, that's a big part of what we do on the Hill too. So it's not just that we are pushing for something exact like this PRMRP ask,
Mm-hmm.
but we do a lot of work on the Hill, letting staffers know who we are and what we do. So in March, we had a briefing in conjunction with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which you spoke at, and so did some of our other board members, where we talked about the overlap of gambling addiction and suicide. That was co hosted by the Mental Health Caucus in the Senate, which was really awesome to have their support. That briefing didn't have a specific, this is the policy X we want you guys to do. It was educational. And you
Mm-hmm.
saw how many staffers came. And then virtually, on our Facebook Live, we had hundreds of more people watching. There's a role there as well, not just in we want you to pass X bill, but here's who we are as NCPG. We
Right.
have boots on the ground in DC, and we're here to help you understand this issue, point you in the right direction, and help you decide how you want to tackle it. Definitely that played a role as well.
For sure, for sure. And I can tell you from my own perspective as a veteran and former military service member who struggled with a gambling addiction, the efforts that are going on nationwide right now, right? But I'll focus on NCPG because I'm talking to you right now, and of course I'm on the board. But the efforts that are happening right now to raise that awareness, not across the country from all different walks of life, but for me specifically close to my heart, military and veteran, right?
Mm-hmm.
The efforts are getting intense, the efforts are getting greater, and the cool part about it is there seems to be ears out there that are now listening and starting to engage in the process, and that to me is powerfully encouraging.
It's kind of interesting how it's worked, right, Dave? Like sports betting has been legalized and it's almost nationwide. I know not quite,
Mhm.
at least on the legal apps. And with that has come many different challenges, a lot of different harm that we're working to minimize. But if you want to put a little bit of a silver lining, it's also brought a lot of opportunity for us when we go to the Hill. I mean, every senator has seen a sports betting ad. It's no longer, it used to be when we were on the Hill, we got a lot of, well, that's a state issue. Pennsylvania can decide what to do with their casinos.
Right.
We're not going to get into that field. But that's not what we hear anymore. Well, gambling is now thought of as a more nationwide thing. We see the ads during major sporting events. And so it's no longer, you kind of don't get the anymore of like, well, this is just for the state to figure out. It's like
Yeah.
we're all paying attention now.
Exactly. Exactly. So, given all this and given the conversation getting started and this monumental, as small as it might seem to some people, this is huge. What has just happened is very, very big.
Yeah,
Do you foresee this really opening up the conversation as it relates to service members and gambling? Do you see this hopefully? What is your hope? Let me ask it that way. What's your hope going forward? Let's envision 5 years down the road, right? The
sure.
conversation starts today. What do you envision happening over the next 5 years in this space?
I don't like making predictions like that. That's tough. I will say that my hope is that when I go to a senator's office for the next issue that we decide to tackle, it's no longer what is gambling addiction? I've never heard of this. No one's ever talked to me about this. It's, oh, I kind of remember we did some work on that in the PRMRP, didn't we?
Right.
Like, yeah, we did. Okay, so yeah, so now we have research coming. What do we do with this research? And so it's a snowball effect, as you understand, and it builds. So
Yeah.
5 years from now is hard to say. What I said there is at least in the vein of what I hope. I hope that it's no longer what is this? It's I know what this is, and I
Hmm.
do and I do know it's a problem. Now what do we tackle next? So
Okay.
it's starting on step two instead of step one. And then hopefully a year or two from now, I'll be back on this podcast telling you about something we've done with your help and with our stakeholders' help that's gotten us to step three. And so now we have
Hmm.
senators saying, okay, like I know we did X and I know we did Y, and now I want to do more. I want to do more because there are still service members who are suffering or something like that.
Yeah. And what a great vision. I very similar to the way I envision it happening. We can't, I mean, listen, I'm a recovering gambler. Most of us want things to happen yesterday, right? But I've
Exactly.
learned, and especially in this space, that that's not the way it works. It's an evergreen. We gotta let it grow. We gotta let it flourish. And
It's
we're off
yeah,
to a great start. And I want to say this, Cole, before I wrap it up. I want to thank you personally for all of the work that you put in all of these areas, not just for military service members and veterans, but across the board for legislation and the work that you do with the leagues to help keep us going and keep leagues aware. I just personally want to give you my thanks for all the work that you do.
well, thanks, Dave. That really means a lot coming from you. I mean, I genuinely care. That's all I can say is I genuinely care
Yeah.
about this issue. I want to mitigate these harms. Very energized to do that. But I want to thank you too because you came and volunteered so much of your time. And I made a joke to you a few times around the hill, but it's true. I get paid to be here and you don't. You're there because you just genuinely care and want this problem to get better for service members.
It's my
So
mission.
it's your mission and you live it every day.
So I want to give a huge thank you to Cole Wogoman, Director of Government Relations and League Partnerships for the National Council on Problem Gambling, for sitting here with me over the last 45 minutes or so and just talking about something that I believe could be the start of something really big. Cole, thank you for taking the time. Any final thoughts from you?
No, but thank you for your support and thank you for everybody who helped make this come true. Like when I talked about the state affiliates, when I talked about our industry partners, when I talked about the board members like yourself, when I talked about our other members who all wrote in to their member of Congress talking about how important this is to them. Thanks to everyone. It was a
Yeah.
group effort.
I'll echo that. I'll echo that thanks to everybody who took part in this. Because it is the Fall In podcast, I'm simply going to say dismissed.